ChristopherKHo is known for materially exquisite objects that draw equally from learned material about and lived encounters with power and otherness in an unevenly decolonized, increasingly networked world. Having left Hong Kong for Los Angeles as a child in the late 1970s, the artist visited his birthplace almost 4 decades later. The adult homecoming provided the artist perspective to rethink his identity of a Western-educated member of the Chinese diaspora. Ho's two-part work, Always Stop Eating While You're Still a Little Hungry, consists of a miniature model theater perched on the lower deck of the Yasumoto Bridge, in conversation with a large-scale window decal visible across the ravine. Reference from the Ford theaters, where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, the miniature theater is multicolored and has a small kind of scene of a Thanksgiving dinner inside. 4 primary patterns are based off various crowds. One is based off of 4th of July parade in the US. The second is based off of the crowds at the 1984 LA Olympics. The third is based off of British soldiers marching at Colonial Williamsburg, which is the Rockefeller Foundation initiative to preserve a historic site in Virginia, and they are reenactment of British soldier. The fourth is from George Balanchine's ballet to John Philip Sousa, Stars and Stripes Forever. With the use of stereogram and optical illusion, the artist purposely hide another image underneath the primary patterns. Visitor needs to stare at the signifier, the red and yellow duck, and cross their eyes to see the multiple patterns. Specifically, the hidden patterns are decoy ducks, man-made objects resembling a real duck. Duck decoys are sometimes used in duck hunting to fool real ducks into landing onto the water. By deliberately implying various layers of decoy through his imagery, Chris reflects on the underside of nationalistic spectacle and intentional manipulation of cultural discourse. The voting table underneath the miniature theater engenders visitors' imagination that Mary Lou springs onto the vault and lands cleanly onto J.C. Hall. Artists recall his childhood memory of watching the '84 Olympics in LA and witnessing Mary Lou had done her 2 final perfect 10 vaults to win the women's all-around. Looking back at that, artist understands the Olympic have other nationalistic, political, and more serious meanings. Boycotted by USSR, the 1984 Olympics in LA loses powerhouses in the field of gymnastics. The artist highlights Redden's ending pose and captures the moment of her awaiting applause with a strained smile and a well-trained body gesture. She represented a nation while simultaneously revealing discipline and struggle as an individual. The figure alludes to the underside of nationalism. At once it is euphoric and hysteric, celebratory and unsettling. ChristopherKHo is known for materially exquisite objects that draw equally from learned material about and lived encounters with power and otherness in an unevenly decolonized, increasingly networked world. Having left Hong Kong for Los Angeles as a child in the late 1970s, the artist visited his birthplace almost 4 decades later. The adult homecoming provided the artist perspective to rethink his identity of a Western-educated member of the Chinese diaspora. Ho's two-part work, Always Stop Eating While You're Still a Little Hungry, consists of a miniature model theater perched on the lower deck of the Yasumoto Bridge, in conversation with a large-scale window decal visible across the ravine. Reference from the Ford theaters, where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, the miniature theater is multicolored and has a small kind of scene of a Thanksgiving dinner inside. 4 primary patterns are based off various crowds. One is based off of 4th of July parade in the US. The second is based off of the crowds at the 1984 LA Olympics. The third is based off of British soldiers marching at Colonial Williamsburg, which is the Rockefeller Foundation initiative to preserve a historic site in Virginia, and they are reenactment of British soldier. The fourth is from George Balanchine's ballet to John Philip Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever. With the use of stereogram and optical illusion, the artist purposely hide another image underneath the primary patterns. Visitor needs to stare at the signifier, the red and yellow duck, and cross their eyes to see the multiple patterns. Specifically, the hidden patterns are decoy ducks, man-made objects resembling a real duck. Duck decoys are sometimes used in duck hunting to fool real ducks into landing onto the water. By deliberately implying various layers of decoy through his imagery, Chris reflects on the underside of nationalistic spectacle and intentional manipulation of cultural discourse. The voting table underneath the miniature theater engenders visitors' imagination that Mary Loretin springs onto the vault and lands cleanly onto J.C. Hall. Artists recall his childhood memory of watching the '84 Olympics in LA and witnessing Mary Loretin had done her two final perfect 10 vaults to win the women's all-around. Looking back at that, artist understands the Olympic have other nationalistic, political, and more serious meanings. Boycotted by USSR, the 1984 Olympics in LA loses powerhouses in the field of gymnastics. The artist highlights Retin's ending pose and captures the moment of her awaiting applause with a strained smile and a well-trained body gesture. She represented a nation while simultaneously revealing discipline and struggle as an individual. The figure alludes to the underside of nationalism. At once it is euphoric and hysteric, celebratory and unsettling. ChristopherKHo is known for materially exquisite objects that draw equally from learned material about and lived encounters with power and otherness in an unevenly decolonized, increasingly networked world. Having left Hong Kong for Los Angeles as a child in the late 1970s, the artist visited his birthplace almost 4 decades later. The adult homecoming provided the artist perspective to rethink his identity of a Western-educated member of the Chinese diaspora. Ho's two-part work, Always Stop Eating While You're Still a Little Hungry, consists of a miniature model theater perched on the lower deck of the Yasumoto Bridge, in conversation with a large-scale window decal visible across the ravine. Reference from the Ford theaters, where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, the miniature theater is multicolored and has a small kind of scene of a Thanksgiving dinner inside. 4 primary patterns are based off various crowds. One is based off of 4th of July parade in the US. The second is based off of the crowds at the 1984 LA Olympics. The third is based off of British soldier marching at Colonial Williamsburg, which is the Rockefeller Foundation initiative to preserve a historic site in Virginia, and they are reenactment of British soldier. The fourth is from George Balanchine's ballet to John Philip Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever. With the use of stereogram and optical illusion, the artist purposely hide another image underneath the primary patterns. Visitor needs to stare at the signifier, the red and yellow duck, and cross their eyes to see the multiple patterns. Specifically, the hidden patterns are decoy ducks, man-made objects resembling a real duck. Duck decoys are sometimes used in duck hunting to fool real ducks into landing onto the water. By deliberately implying various layers of decoy through his imagery, Chris reflects on the underside of nationalistic spectacle and intentional manipulation of cultural discourse. The voting table underneath the miniature theater engenders visitors' imagination that Mary Loretin springs onto the vault and lands cleanly onto J.C. Hall. Artists recall his childhood memory of watching the '84 Olympics in LA and witnessing Mary Loretin had done her 2 final perfect 10 vaults to win the women's all-around. Looking back at that, artist understands the Olympic have other nationalistic, political, and more serious meanings. Boycotted by USSR, the 1984 Olympics in LA loses powerhouses in the field of gymnastics. The artist highlights Reddin's ending pose and captures the moment of her awaiting applause with a strained smile and a well-trained body gesture. She represented a nation while simultaneously revealing discipline and struggle as an individual. The figure alludes to the underside of nationalism. At once it is euphoric and hysteric, celebratory and unsettling.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today I'm with ChristopherKHo. I'm looking forward to having a really interesting conversation with him. He's an incredible artist. I'm going to start just by introducing myself and then Chris, and we'll take it from there. I'm Willem Molesworth. I'm the director of Sarthe, a contemporary art gallery based here in Hong Kong. I've worked with many prominent contemporary artists, some of whom include Nadim Abbas, Double Fly Art Center, Li Liao, Lu Bolin, Andrew Luck, Macking-Tong Tu, and Ren Hong. I've also worked closely with 20th century artists like Chen Zhen, Chu Dechun, Hans Artung, Atsuko Tanaka, and Zhao Wuqi. I'm a board member of the vice president of the Hong Kong Art Gallery Association, as well as the co-organizer of an art fair called Unscheduled. Along with my wife, Isabel, I'm also the co-founder of Suitcase Institute, a traveling platform for the itinerant exhibition of art in any space or location. ChristopherKHo is a speculative artist based in New York, Hong Kong, and Telluride, Colorado. He received his BFA and BS degrees from Cornell University and his MPhil from Columbia University. His practice encompasses making, organizing, writing, and teaching. He is known for materially exquisite objects that draw equally from learned material about and lived encounters with power and otherness in an unevenly decolonized, increasingly networked world. His recent solo shows include Dear John at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, Aloha to the World at Don Ho Terrace at the Bronx Museum of Arts, and CX888 at the Sarthe Gallery in Hong Kong. And that is where I first met Chris when he was invited to participate in the second annual Sarthe Artist Residency by Curatorial Initiative Forever and Today. And so I'll now pass over to Chris.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen before I start talking. And just let me know if you guys can see my screen.
Yep.
Great. Thank you to Willem for that introduction, and also to Tiffany, Doris, and Pauline at Asia Society for organizing this event. As Willem mentioned, we met through Sarthe Gallery, his gallery, back in the summer of 2018, when I did a project there through the curatorial platform Forever and Today. And that project from the Sarthe Gallery sowed the seeds for much of my work that came subsequently, including my work for Asia Society. So what I think I'll do today is I'll share with you that project, CX888 from the Sarthe, and then discuss in more detail the project at Asia Society. And our conversation will meander, and I'll pause once in a while and pass the baton over to Willem, and we can also have an organic conversation afterwards with Q&A from question from the audience members if there are any questions. So this is not my piece from the Sarthe Gallery. Rather, it's Andrew Luke's, and Andrew was the artist in residence the year before me. And I wanted to show this to you, one, because Andrew is in Asia Society's next exhibition. And I also wanted to show you to let you know why, or to give you a sense of why I felt so anxious going into this residency. After all, the opportunity that Willem and Forever and Today gave me was for my first solo project in Hong Kong, my birthplace. And I remember Nick Yu from Blind Spot coming in one day during the process of putting this together. And these are a couple of shots of what the gallery looked like at the early weeks of that summer. And Nick asked me, well, you know, Chris, what do you actually want from this? Like, tell me what your aspirations are. And my answer surprised even myself. My answer to Nick was, I wanted to be accepted. I wanted the Hong Kong art world to embrace me. I wanted to prove my worth. And I think formally and procedurally, that kind of desire to want to belong manifested itself in the kind of high labor of this project, the kind of constant moving of these floor tiles, and also in the kind of frenetic activity, which I think registers even in the final exhibition. In many ways, I think of this anxiety and desire to belong as characteristic of an immigrant to a new place. And I think the only twist here was not so much that I was an immigrant to Hong Kong, so much as I was coming back to Hong Kong. And yet I found, or I felt, all of those same emotions and feelings of anxiety and wanting to be accepted. And in fact, this honestly was one of the most emotional shows I've ever done. And during my flight from New York City to Hong Kong for the residency, I used a feeling wheel, which we see on the left, to record on my Instagram my ever evolving feelings during the journey. Now, why, you might ask, did I feel like I needed to be accepted? Well, in Hong Kong. Well, in 2018, we were still amidst Donald Trump's presidency. And increasingly, it became apparent during his presidency that immigrants like me were unwelcomed. And I wondered, if not the United States, which had been my de facto home for a good number of decades, could Hong Kong be home? And of course, ironically, Hong Kong, has since grappled with its own identity since 2018. But back then, 2016 was the year that Trump was elected, and 2016 was also the year that one of my art heroes, Andrea Fraser, published this giant tome that we see here, which meticulously traced the connections between art collectors, museums, and US politicians. Fraser was, in some ways, also responding to the election of Donald Trump. Because in the preface to this book, she reflects on why the left lost the 2016 election in the United States. And I'm going to read a short passage. Quote, "The right won the 2016 election because they identified elitism and class power with expertise and education, with cultural capital rather than economic capital. They, the right, mobilized economically precarious whites against cosmopolitan liberals. The left," so the left being Andrea Fraser, an artist, "failed to recognize cultural capital as a real form of power that produces real forms of domination." And I do want to return to this idea of cultural capital, which is so central to us as artists or gallerists or cultural producers later. But for now, I just want to note my initial reaction to reading this preface and reading Andrea Fraser's book. For me, shadowing Fraser's statement is a longtime opposition, a longtime Western opposition between the proletariat on the one hand and capitalists on the other. So the kind of horizontal axis here. Artists always are on the left, long traditions coming from, say, Russian constructivists and other avant-garde groups. And collectors and commercial galleries, yay, Willem, would be in the right-hand category with the capitalists. But what happened in 2016 is a paramount capitalist ran for the US presidency as a populist, the proletarian's American cousin, and accused the left of elitism. So for someone like Trump, the liberal elite included left-leaning academics like Andrea Fraser, politicians, entrenched politicians like Hillary Clinton, scientists, and institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so Fraser was kind of registering this odd flip from horizontal axis, proletariat versus capitalism, capitalists, which was kind of pre-2016, to this vertical axis, where the capitalist becomes the populace and the proletariat becomes the liberal elite. And she registered it, obviously belatedly, not in time to do anything about the 2016 election, as I did, also registered this belatedly. But for me, something was also missing from Fraser's otherwise astute analysis of what happened in the US in 2016. Because the 2016 election wasn't just about liberals becoming elite. It was also about non-whites. And the conversation, I thought, should address that intersection between class, race, and ethnicity. American exceptionalism once presented a bridge and a beacon. So my parents, for instance, moved to the US from Hong Kong when I was a kid, because the US granted freedoms that were in doubt post-1997, and because it's a decent, moderately taxed place to accumulate capital. But Trump's unwelcoming of immigrants foreclosed this option, extinguished this American exceptionalism. And this foreclosure, I think, unfortunately resounds and continues to resound in violent ways for Asians and Asian Americans in the US, especially as during his presidency, Trump insisted on calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. So instead of the promise of American exceptionalism, under Trump, the right lurched towards white nationalism. And that begat the parallel rise of long-distance nationalism. And that's a term from the late, great Southeast Asian scholar Benedict Anderson. And it's one that describes, say, a member of the Chinese diaspora feeling more affine to China than he or she does to his home country, the United States, despite maybe having been educated in the US and even raising a family in the US. So exploring alternatives to both white and long-distance nationalisms became the goal or the core of this project in 2018 for the Sarthe Gallery. And one intriguing kind of counter or solution to nationalism came from the editor Mimi Wong, to become a global rather than a national citizen, in a sense to join the transnational elite who feel or see no national boundaries. And for this, it would be airplanes and hotels that would be the primary backdrop for international life. Which brings me to CX888, the main component of my work at Desart, and named after Cathay Pacific's recently canceled daily tri-county flight from Hong Kong to Vancouver to New York. And on the left is an installation view with beach chairs arranged in the 2-2 configuration of Cathay Dragon's regional business class, with the monitors in the front blinking respectively, the teal of Cathay Pacific and the maroon of Cathay Dragon. And these monitors blink these colors in heroic hexameter, the meter used in the Odyssey, which is a poem about homecoming. So the kind of theme about the show was kind of homecoming and finding a place where I belong. And then on the right are just kind of fun things that indicate more airline themed things. There's a Boeing 777 aircraft that I actually bought from the seatback catalog during my flight from New York to Hong Kong. And then also on the bottom right, there are some paper airplanes that are actually made out of metal based on segments of the feeling wheel that I showed you earlier. And elsewhere in the gallery, oops, look at that. Elsewhere in the gallery, floor tiles were taken out to form a kind of bird or airplane's eye view of the coastline and the ocean. And fabric was thrown over gallery equipment as if drop cloths over furniture at a country home that has been closed for the season. And on the upper left, we see a hammer, the gallery's hammer, underneath this yellow cloth. And of course, once we stuck it in there, both Willem and I needed it for subsequent installation work, which was a lot of fun. Some more detail shots from the show. On the left, childhood photographs from annual trips to and from Hong Kong with stopovers in Hawaii. And on the right, a blank plane ticket that sits in a pool of dried coffee. Now, of course, we all know what happened soon after 2018. CX-888, that route that the show is named after, it actually no longer exists. And Cathay Dragon has been folded into Cathay Pacific. Across the world, the pandemic has grounded airlines and emptied hotels. So the question really, and I want to open this up in a second to Willem, is what do you do? Just as I had planned on returning to Hong Kong to kind of play out this theme or this solution to nationalism, and that is transnationalism, COVID-19 left transnational travel pretty much impossible. And where does this leave this train of thought from this art onward? This somewhat frictionless and relatively unencumbered idea of being a global citizen. And I think it certainly complicates it. Events certainly complicate this trajectory. And I would love to pass the baton over to Willem to speak a bit about the Suitcase Institute, his initiative, which I think grappled with all of these same issues.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Really interesting. I think, we talked about this, which is why I'm now going to kind of speak to Suitcase Institute. It's really an interesting kind of like case study on the very immediate impacts just how much life has changed post-COVID, pre and post-COVID in many ways. And it's interesting to think about. So in a nutshell, Suitcase Institute, we ask artists to create exhibitions or artworks inside a suitcase that could then travel freely in the said suitcase. And the goal of this initiative is to kind of bring art into spheres where it's not normally seen. So outside of museums, into other kind of even street spaces or parks or what have you, as well as the normal kind of settings. A big part of that is international travel and the ease of transporting suitcases. The fact that you can kind of just pack one up, pass it off to a friend and have them take it to London or Hong Kong or New York or anywhere, right? That very kind of casual, easy kind of statement to make in 2018 now seems just like so offensive and absurdist, right? Could you take this suitcase for me? It's nowadays you wouldn't think twice about asking someone to take a piece of luggage for you like that. I think that alone speaks to how transnationalism and just the world by Nicole Wong. This is a taxidermied fox in a suitcase. The fox was ethically sourced. It's as ethically as these things can be. It's a vintage fox. And what you can do is all the papers and apples and crystals and photos there that you see beside it are added in a performance. When the suitcase is first opened, it's just the fox. And then a docent standing next to it encourages people to come and engage with it. You can write it a note, you can light a candle, you can give it some food. You're supposed to engage with it as if it's on a journey and as if it's your last chance to speak with it. And so that's interesting as well, because it's about passing. It's about life and death, and how we move through these stages. Similarly to how we used to kind of move through places, and now seem to be just stagnant and stuck. Yeah. I guess you want to move on to yes. This is another suitcase that we're showing that we have by Shane Aspergren. It's this one has to do a lot with ritual, which is very interesting. How we ritualize and often, well, what is ritual really, and how rituals come about. There's a process wherein we ask participants to come and engage with these kind of strange objects and develop their own rituals through a kind of like mantra and meditation, which is a lot to ask of people, but has been really interesting to see how it works and where it works, how it works in parks much better and libraries much better than it does in like a street corner, which is also very interesting. Yeah. Here we have it. This was when it was exhibited in Tai Kwun, here in Hong Kong at the Heritage and Cultural Center. Yeah. I think that's about it for me.
Well, I am also have the honor of having been invited to contribute a suitcase to William and Isabel's Suitcase Institute. And super briefly, just going back to this idea of this, pre-COVID frictionless and unencumbered notion of transnationalism, I wanted to both acknowledge the unencumberdness of transnationalism in the past, using this golf bag as my suitcase, redolent of kind of elites traveling from Deepwater Bay to Pebble Beach, but contrasting this kind of old style idea of mobility, the suitcase, the golf bag, the kind of mobility of the golfing class, with a newer kind of mobility altogether, quantum teleportation. Coincidentally or not, just as COVID halted airplane travel, late last year, NASA researchers achieved for the first time sustained high fidelity quantum teleportation of photons over 44 kilometers or 27 miles. So in this in-process piece, this is not done yet, I thought about including things that looked like satellite receivers, a moon, and microphone stands. And over 8 points along this kind of weird infrastructure, this quasi-scientific looking infrastructure, there are 8 points where a fish on the left transforms into a hedgehog on the right. And these are two versions of this, what I'm calling a kind of quantum transformation. And here are the final metal cutouts that will be clipped onto the microphone stands, made to look like they're actually on metal, but they're made to look like they are hand-drawn silhouettes. And that idea of quantum morphing, which I'll just mention briefly here before diving back into Asia society. And that project of Yuan's is about world building after a pandemic, after Trump, after ecological and political upheavals. And in this project, I was inspired by the illustrator Ed Emberley, who used very simple basic shapes like a rectangle or a triangle to build proper nouns and populate a world, a universe. And so I started doing this. I started trying to build a world starting from a single unit, a square, where everything is interconnected to that square, and eventually settled on a full array of interconnected objects. And this array that we're looking at here will become the basis for my installation for Yuan in Finland, whether it's cutouts that are placed on the ground or something like this, where these shapes are standing upright. Now, returning to Asia Society, I want to say that Asia Society, my work for Asia Society, takes a slightly different tact. Rather than embracing transnationalism the way CX888 did at the Sarthe, or embracing quantum transformation, as my work for Suitcase Institute will, or even be future-looking in terms of world building after a pandemic, the way that my project for Finland will be. This project acknowledges residual nationalisms. And what I mean by that is that I think I realized what COVID kind of taught me, and also Trump and upticks of nationalisms around the world taught me, is that as much as we can valorize a transnational subject, the fact is that we remain very much in a world that is ruled by or guided by Westphalian notions of nation states. So it's a two-part installation for those who haven't had a chance to see it. And it's titled Always Stop Eating While You're Still a Little Hungry. On the right, there's a brass model looking at, on the left, a banner featuring US gymnast Mary Lou Retton, who won the all-around gymnastics gold during the LA Olympics in 1984. And the model theater itself, and here I just isolated the four facets of it, and after Ford's Theater, which is the theater where US President Lincoln was shot. And it sits on a pedestal reminiscent of a gymnast's vault. And here's a section on the right of the now demolished Ford's Theater in Washington, DC. And then for the curtains, for the kind of details of this model, I used traditional formats with, honestly, these totally obnoxious names like Empire and Victory and Squire. Center stage was a the work is still up through March, is a miniature table set with a tiny glimmering Thanksgiving turkey. And I should mention here also that the installation's title, Always Stop Eating While You're Still a Little Hungry, comes from John D. Rockefeller Sr. It was one of his favorite quotes or quips. And I always found the contrast between the restraint of that quotation and the excesses of his fortune to be really interesting. And of course, Rockefeller money also helped fund Asia Society. So here's a detail of one of the sides of the model. And for those of a certain age, or for those who are into kind of psychedelic art, you'll realize that what we're looking at is the magic eye. It's an autostereogram. So if you stare at it, even on the computer screen, and you cross your eyes using the red and yellow, the Chinese red, Chinese yellow swans at the top, so that your right eye looks at the red and your left eye looks at the yellow, a secret image will appear. And I made these magic eyes by combining backgrounds drawn from American spectacles, like in this case, the LA Olympics, but in some of the other sides of the model, Republican National Conventions, 4th of July parades, George Balanchine's ballet, Stars and Stripes, and marches at Colonial Williamsburg, another Rockefeller initiative, and combined those with decoy ducks from the Rockefeller's Americana collection. So that's the theater, and here's the theater at night. What about the banner? So the banner is 432 feet long, and kudos to Tiffany and Doris and the installation team at Asia Society for doing this. And it's viewable from where the model theater sits. It features, as mentioned, the US all-around gymnast gold winner during the 1984 Olympics. So why, you might be asking, 1984? What's so special about 1984? Well, first of all, that was the first Olympics where the PRC on the right and the Republic of China, aka Taiwan on the left, competed together since the war. 1984 for us was also the year, very important, that Britain signed the joint Sino-British Declaration, giving Hong Kong back to the PRC. And so here we have an instance of decolonization, which is, ever the popular term in artistic and academic discourse, but complicated by the fact that Hong Kong wasn't exactly becoming free. It was in some ways being punted from one empire to the next. So residual nationalisms also showed up during the protests in Hong Kong when I was, as an American, shocked to see the proliferation of American flags being used to symbolize a kind of leftist democratic cause. And the reason I was shocked is simultaneously in the US that very summer, those same American flags were used to symbolize white nationalism, white patriarchy, and anti-Black Lives Matter protests. And I'm very curious to talk to William in a few minutes about how national symbols can be read differently in different contexts. And of course, the kind of white nationalism symbolized by the American flag in the US accumulated not only in crimes against Asian Americans, but also an actual insurrection on January 6th. Now, I want to end with this image and this book. It was this kind of uptick in anti-Asian as well as anti-Black and anti-Brown racism in the US that prompted me and my co-editor of this book, Daisy Nam, who's a curator at Ballroom Marfa, to compile 73 letters written in 2020 by Asian Americans in the arts. And the letters kind of collectively capture what seems like an unprecedented moment in politics and society through the prism of Asian American artists, curators, educators, art historians, editors, writers, and designers. And they do so in a way that is intimate and direct. I mean, letters have an addressee and a signatory, in contrast to anonymous posts in the echo chambers of the internet. Letters kind of carry the sound of the writer's voice, and letters, of course, can also set the record straight. Some Hong Kongers or Hong Kong connected people in this book include Alex Lau from Empty Gallery, Byron Kim, Spencer Ye, Candice Lin, Don Chan, Hira Chen, Herb Tam, Holly Shen, John Tain, Kaman Tay, Ken Lum, Kenneth Tam, and the estate of Martin Wong. And I'm sure I'm missing, Hong Kongers are everywhere, so I'm sure I'm missing some Hong Kong connected contributor in this list of 73 people. Now, I want to conclude this presentation with by sharing two revelations that I had while editing this book. Number one, first, when Daisy and I started brainstorming potential contributors, and we limited our search to those with strong ties to North America, we were shocked at how long that list became. So it turns out that Asian Americans, are active and vibrant in every aspect of contemporary art. And yet somehow, even to us, other Asians, they remained invisible. And so the question really for the audience members to contemplate is, what does it mean to be seen by others and to see each other in a Western-centric art world? The second revelation that we had was that several contributors expressed deep gratitude for being given, for the first time, a forum to explore their Asian American or Asian identity in relationship to their practice, to their art practice, their upbringing, their place in the world, their aspirations for the future. And having known many of these contributors personally for decades, I was so dismayed that one could work for decades in cultural fields in the US and never be asked about one's culture on one's own terms. And so this brings us back to the quotation by Andrea Fraser that I opened with about cultural capital. I'll reread that sentence. She writes, "The left failed to recognize cultural capital as a real form of power," end quote. And I would add, in conclusion, that our task today is not only to recognize cultural capital as a real form of power, but also to deploy that power as cultural producers. So thank you very much. And let's open it up to an organic conversation and or questions from audience members.
Yeah, I think that was a really incredibly interesting, Chris, and what a interesting point to end on, right? I think as soon as that's immediately where my mind went when you read the quote the first time was how do we then work towards fixing this narrative? What can we do in order to harness the power that we hold, or how do we re-engage it in a way that can also undo the existent narrative of us now being perceived as liberal elites, right? Or as artists being perceived as liberal elites. And I think that's really tricky. And I think a lot of it is tricky because, and this is something else we're going to get into, is that, you know, there is no fixed symbolism for transnationalism and for like a global elite and a global citizenry. These symbols that we engage in and these narratives that we weave are so often completely understood to be polar opposite in different contexts. And I think we can see that so clearly, even just looking at the protest movement here in Hong Kong versus what America went through over the past several years with Trump as president. I mean, in you know, what strikes me as a particularly interesting kind of uncomfortable parallel as a Jew, because I'm Jewish, is, for example, is Pepe the Frog. There's an instance where you have a very clear-cut example of what's seen here as a very liberal symbol that's like in support of the protest movement, where in America it's seen as a Nazi, alt-right, extremist, conservative symbol. And I think that is very, interesting to think about and important to recognize in terms of how to move forward in terms of creating symbols and dialogue and conversations in ways that speak to everyone and mean the same thing, which is difficult. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think Pepe the Frog is an amazing example of this idea of a single symbol telegraphing very different things. I recently actually during one of Asia Art Archive's events, heard someone speak about the recent Thai protests and how it's a gesture from the movie The Hunger Games that has become the kind of enduring symbol, rallying cry for many anti-royalist Thai protesters. And, you know, from the outside, there's something that seems so silly about that, right? I mean, it's a Hollywood movie that's fictional, you know. But the historian who wrote this text argued, I think quite cogently, that for Thai people, it is just about visibility. They needed something that the Western news media would pick up on. And by having the Western news media's eyes on them, they felt protected to a certain extent. And so I think that's a really interesting case where it's less about what, you know, Pepe the Frog or the American flag or the hand gesture from the Hunger Games, what it exactly telegraphs. It could be left or right, but really it's just about almost like a thing to get people to look at you and write about you, the media to write about you. So I thought that was also kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you feel like Pepe the Frog could function that way.
Or perhaps does. I certainly feel like one of the real hot button things you would hear about in the protest movement here was optics. Was how things were being perceived in the West, and that being the source of power during the protest movement is how visible things were to the Western media. I think that's a very interesting point to make. Yeah, I mean, you know, part of what I think what makes this complicated is that the gut reaction to challenges like COVID, like pandemics, is a refocusing on the local and a total ignorance towards the international or the transnational. And that's something I should have mentioned when we talked about Suitcase Institute, right? Is what have we done in response to the fact that the whole structure of what we wanted to do is no longer feasible, and it simply was to focus locally, right? And similar to what you've done. I mean, your suitcase is square with you right now, and God knows when we're going to have it. And as much as it is embracing this notion of like, oh, we could theoretically transport it to you, right? Like these ideas. It's, you know, the reality is we can't right now, and I think that makes it that leaves a big challenge for us as cultural purveyors and creators in restructuring things, right? Yeah.
We do have a question, Willem, to both of us, and I'll read it out. It says, under the current President Biden's government, how will the Asian or Chinese identity change? To be determined, to be seen. I mean, Biden is far more of an internationalist than Trump was. So the expectation is that he'll open up diplomatic channels again and act through more conventional forms of diplomacy. However, in terms of its relationship to the PRC, it will likely remain hawkish, if only because after Trump, for real reasons or not, the PRC has become a convenient antagonist for the American electorate. Now, I think that Biden is far more, I'll just say it, intelligent than Trump in being able to distinguish Asian and Chinese nationality from Asian Americans. So you got this sense during Trump's handling of both Hong Kong protests, but also the uptick of Asian racism, anti-Asian racism during the pandemic, that he was not making a distinction between that. It really had to do with what you looked like, not your nationality, not your citizenship. So I believe that Biden will fix that part of things, even if the larger international relation between the US and China remains fraught for probably a couple more years. Honestly, probably for our lifetimes, as China continues its ascent economically and politically and militarily, and the US begins to slip down to pole position.
Yeah.
Another question here says, to Chris, any plan to work in Hong Kong again after the pandemic? Oh my God, I can't wait to get back to Hong Kong. In fact, I was telling Willem and Isabel just 2 weeks ago that I am in a small town in Colorado with not a single Chinese restaurant, not even an American Chinese restaurant, and I am dying. So I very much hope to work in Hong Kong again after the pandemic. Yes, I cannot wait.
That's interesting. Is that, Chris, do you think that might be why you're, an experience like that you're very much in the midst of right now, and you have been for months, right? Do you think that might be part of why you're also so kind of interested in exploring a global identity or transnational kind of identity? Simply,
I think it does.
Yeah.
I think it does have something to do with it. And actually, your comment earlier about the pandemic kind of forcing us to become local, whether you're a gallerist and you now show local artists, or you just, it's you literally only order out from a certain radius that can deliver to your home, which is a form of local. I was thinking how different that is from the kind of very romantic notion of local that kind of came to the fore in the first decade of the 2000s, when we were talking about tiny homes and locavores and shopping very close to home for locally sourced goods. It's a very different, because we're forced into it this time. It has a very different tenor to it, which I find absolutely fascinating. Before I forget though, Will, you started your comment or question during this session about how we fix the narrative and how do we counter maybe the art world's transformation from radicals to an elite, a liberal elite. I actually do want to hear more about that from you, because I too agree that the forms and possibilities of political art towards social transformation is at a tipping point. I sense, and this is why I want to hear from you, I sense that there are new strategies and methods of political art or socially transformative art, how to fix the narrative, how to counter. But I don't know exactly what they are. Like, I just sense that we're a little tired of older versions of this, of political art. And I would love to hear from you about this.
I mean, I think, I don't know. I don't really know, right? As a gallerist, I think I'm almost like a voyeur. I'm observing. That's kind of like just all I can do. And I try to make observations from whatever kind of minute lived experience I have. Because it's the question of the times, how this conversation evolves and changes. And it is at a very radical kind of tipping point. I think maybe what I'm starting to see across a lot of different artists' practices, yourself included, which is why it was very interesting to see and hear you talk about Finland, and maybe this is where it'll lead us, is world building. Is this notion that perhaps that the answer is to actually construct something entirely different, or utopian, or just building something, working towards creating a future, and that kind of vision of a future, and allowing that to breed some sort of like collective identity, perhaps. But it is obviously it's difficult. Yeah.
I love that answer.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love that answer, and that would be that absolutely. I just noticed a question in the chat from Isabel, Um, and she writes, could you talk briefly about what you consider to be, quote, cultural capital? I feel that government bodies / corporate organizations have their own definitions. True, but I'm interested in hearing what your thoughts are. My follow-up question is, how can we reclaim that cultural capital for ourselves as artists? I agree that corporate organizations and government bodies definitely have their own definition of cultural capital. With commercial endeavors, it tends to be called goodwill, the goodwill of a company that adds to its market value. And for government bodies, cultural capital usually manifests itself in soft power, a kind of soft diplomacy or cultural diplomacy. Now, for artists, I think that Willem's thoughts about world building dovetail perfectly with my response to Isabel's question. For far too long, artists, especially in the West, and this is where I think maybe Asian or Hong Kong artists have a leg up, artists in the West have thought of themselves as on the margins and only in a position to critique power, not centered enough or powerful enough to generate new systems and new worlds. And it is a lingering legacy. I had a fascinating discussion this morning with Rashna, a professor at HKU, where she pointed out that that's a very Western, that idea of the artist as this kind of punkish radical is a very Western one. And possibly in Asia, there are other models of artists coming out where cultural capital is something that that an artist will embrace and deploy rather than downplay, right? Rather than say, well, I'm on the margins, I don't have any agency or power, all I can do is critique power. You know, maybe there are other places in the world where that is not the starting attitude. I'm not sure yet. I mean, this is actually something I'd love to bounce back to you, Willem, to ask if you see. I know that you were educated. I mean,
yeah,
in you know, kind of in the same art history, I think that I was, and then maybe you've seen something different now that you've actually moved and spent time in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think there's a really rich history outside of the standard kind of Western art history canon of even literati. The position of like traditional literati class within China is one that's not on the periphery at all, but very much kind of like centered as like a major cultural force. And that's a very different distinction in terms of how they think about themselves and how they position themselves and create, right? And I do see a big shift towards these other kinds of non-Western creative positioning across a lot of the artists I'm working with now. And it's not even just, another really interesting thing is collective practice. This notion of groups of artists working together to create artwork in ways that kind of just like don't fit. I'm even potentially working with this Taiwanese collective who work with a lot of video games, and it's like a rotating membership. And I was trying to explain it to even my own staff about how the membership is so super fluid and very open and everybody contributes. And they were like, I don't know how, I don't understand. How is this working, right? And that, I actually think there's a lot of history and roots in that, which is very interesting. And funny enough, that's also, I didn't even register that, they're also building worlds within online environments, which is really interesting as well. But for our residency, for example, this year, which is yet to be announced, it's for an artist named Bobby Chenpin Tao, and he's a Hong Kong-based architecture major, actually, and he will be literally creating a very immersive world, or multiple worlds and environments within the gallery, literally world building and kind of working off this history of world building within Asia, which I think is really interesting. And I really kind of very much look forward to seeing, and hopefully that repositioning does change things in some way, right?
I love that. I love all three of your answers. Number one, drawing from the literati as a counter to Western Bohemian, kind of Western Bohemian avant-gardes. Two, collective practices and groups of artists. I think that's also absolutely fascinating. And three, of course, world building. Urbanism and architecture, the planning of cities, of mega cities coming up in China, and even the Pearl River Delta, the stitching together of multiple cities to become mega cities. Those are such rich areas for artists, because those are the things that will also kind of define, well, at least in Southern China, kind of define everyday life for another generation. So that Bobby's show or residency sounds incredible.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
So am I. Well, hopefully I'll be able to see it by then.
Yeah, hopefully. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see. All right.
Any other questions from ASHK or even audience members? We're hitting just about our hour limit. We are so on time. We are so Hong Kong and so on time, Willem. It's exactly 58 minutes. We are so close to our 60-minute time limit. Thank you so much, Willem, for participating and having this conversation with me, continuing our conversations really from 2018. So thank you so much for that. And let's pass it back perhaps to Doris, Pauline, and Tiffany, who may have some kind of wrap-up comments to make.
Okay. Thanks, Chris and Willem, for the wonderful sharings. Our exhibition, Next Set Contemporary Arts from Hong Kong, will last until 14 March Sunday. And we are excited to announce that we are able to reopen our galleries tomorrow. So can't wait to see you all again at Asia Societies, and hope you all have a good time tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.